Setting a world record is hard enough. Some records mean you have to stare death itself in the face if you want that kind of fame. But for some unlucky people, death is the only fame they'll get. Today I cover 6 of the most disturbing, most horrifying ways that people tried to break world records and paid for it with their lives. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. When Bill Warner got on his motorbike on July 14, 2013, he didn't expect what was about to come. It was a warm morning in Limestone, Maine at the timed motorbike event held every year at the Loring Air Force runway. Because where else can you try to break the land speed record for motorcycles but on the longest flat piece of tarmac in the state? Bill had a passion for motorbike speed records, and there was no one else like him who could do it. He studied, modified, and reverse-engineered just about everything he could on his Suzuki Hayabusa, which is already a fast bike if you bought it new. But if you want to break records, you need to make some changes. I can't figure out why Bill thought he needed to break the record. After all, it was his own record that he was trying to break. Just 2 years before, Bill had a run of 311 miles per hour in just 1.5 miles of track. But he didn't just set the record, he smashed it. Before him, nobody had ever been faster than 270 miles per hour. But along comes Bill, and in just one day, he breaks 270, 280, 290, 300, and then 310. But that wasn't enough for Bill. He knew that he could push the limits even further. He upped the stakes and challenged himself to hit 300 miles per hour in just 1 mile of track. It seemed like an impossible task, but if you knew Bill, you'd know that he was the only rider on the planet who could make you believe that it could be done. But even Bill knew that this would be his last record. He planned to retire the very next day, sell off his bike, and start his own timed events in Texas. I feel like it's kind of like the movie scenes where a police officer says he's just 1 week from retirement. Fate doesn't like those kind of statements. With a small crowd gathered around, Bill took a few practice attempts down the runway. He had to get the settings just right, everything perfectly dialed in and ready for the big moment. Even if you do hit your max speed, it still takes you another mile to slow down the bike enough to a point where you can control it. Even with a small wind blowing that day, Bill seemed confident that his bike was up to the task. And so with everyone watching, Bill inched up to the line, settled into the carbon fiber aerodynamic shell, and hit full throttle. Like a shot, the bike sped off, almost too fast for cameras to catch. It wasn't Bill's fastest run, as he maxed out at 285 miles per hour. Still faster than any bike had ever been on such a short run, but not fast enough for Bill. It seemed like everything was going well, but when Bill hit the finish line, something was off. The bike suddenly veered off to the right, hitting a 6-inch concrete pedestal. This launched Bill 40 feet up into the air, and his bike continued another 2,000 feet down the track before sliding out and crashing. The medical crew on hand hurried down the runway, ready for the worst, but they were shocked at what they found at the finish line. Bill was badly injured, but amazingly, still awake and talking with the crew who came to help him. As you can imagine, his internal injuries were huge. The sheer force of the crash ruptured Bill's organs. The impact had shattered his bones and his systems were slowly starting to shut down. Bill was dead already, but he didn't know it yet. I think that makes this incident even more tragic. Bill and the medic team probably thought he'd survived the impossible. But a heartbreaking 75 minutes later, his extreme crash finally caught up to him, and he passed away. Investigators had a hard time figuring out what went wrong. It could have been a tire failure or something mechanical. I don't think it's ever possible to figure it out because even the smallest mistake or damaged part can have devastating effects at speeds like that. Most professionals don't believe that Bill's records will be broken for the next 50 years. If you're a fan of boats, you're going to want to stick around to the end. But I have one more motorbike story to tell you that's slightly more extreme than Bill. One warm Thursday morning in June 2021, Alex Harville started up his motorbike, but he didn't know that it would be for the last time. Alex basically grew up on his bike, riding it around his hometown of Ephrata, Washington, doing jumps and stunts whenever he could. And as Alex got older, he got braver, always upping the danger. After all, Alex was looking up to his idol, the famous motorbike stuntman, Evel Knievel. Just like Evel, Alex wanted to go bigger, faster, and longer. But nobody expected what would happen on that abandoned runway at Grant International Airport, just 20 miles from his house. Fast forward to 28-year-old Alex sitting on his motorbike at the Moses Lake Air Show, ready to kick off a 3-day event by breaking a world record jump on his bike. He was the main attraction, and attendees were already gathering before the show, hoping to catch a glimpse of the soon-to-be famous speed demon as he went for a world record 351-foot jump. I don't know what made him think that he needed to do this. He already had 2 Guinness World Records to his name, both while he was still a teenager. Maybe it was because the air show was just a short distance from where one of Evel Knievel did one of his most famous jumps. Or maybe it was because Alex was a born risk-taker. Everyone who knew Alex described him as a light, a genuine joy, a loving husband, and a father of 2 young boys. But there was another side of Alex, a darker side that pushed him to take bigger risks. But not even his family would have predicted how far that dark side would take him. For weeks, Alex had been preparing for this jump. He posted videos and photos to his Instagram, showing the ramp being built and his landing pad, a whole football field away. Alex wasn't dumb. He knew the risks. 4 years earlier, Alex had mistimed a jump in front of a crowd and shattered his foot after crashing. He didn't even think he'd ever be able to race again. But again, that inner daredevil pushed him to get back on the bike and take another Guinness World Record. Not for the crowd, not for his family, not even for his idol. Alex wanted to push the limits of his bike and his body for himself. Just 3 days before the jump, Alex had posted one last ominous message on his Instagram. It was a picture of the completed ramp, Alex smiling in front of it. "I'm getting excited to send this thing," he wrote. Before the main event, Alex checked over his gear. I don't know why Alex hadn't ever tested the ramp or the jump before, but maybe he wanted to save the big moment for the crowds. People noticed that Alex was revving his bike and the crowd started to film him. And as one final practice before the main event, Alex decided to make the jump. He started down the runway from hundreds of feet away and gunned the accelerator. His bike took off from under him, quickly reaching almost 95 miles an hour. He needed the speed for the huge distance between him and the landing ramp. Crowds stopped what they were doing as they saw Alex's final approach. His bike hit the ramp and smoothly took off. It looked like Alex was going to easily make the gap. But then Alex came down just 5 feet short of the ramp. The videos from the day show that Alex's bike slammed at full speed into the dirt ramp, instantly throwing him over the handlebars. Medical staff, who were already waiting, quickly rushed over to Alex's still body. The brutal landing smashed the handlebars into Alex's unprotected chest, fatally damaging internal organs. They loaded Alex into the waiting ambulance and rushed him off the hospital, but it was already too late. Alex was declared dead. I can't imagine how devastated it would be to go from excitement to horror like that. Imagine watching someone taking a huge risk and then falling short right in front of you, all for a world record they already have. But let's continue to a completely different sport in our next disastrous record attempt. Can you imagine what it would be like to be married to your biggest competitor, your rival, but also your idol? That's what life was like for freediver Audrey Mestre. Audrey was fascinated by one of the oldest sports in the world, freediving, where daredevils take a deep breath and go as far underwater as they can. No scuba tank, no aids, nothing but the guts to go as deep as they can. The sport goes back to 4500 BC, when Mesopotamians would send special divers to collect pearls from the bottom of the ocean, and Audrey loved it. I have to admit I panic at just 8 feet of water in the pool, so I can't imagine what it feels like to be hundreds of feet under the ocean with no air. But for her, it was love at first sight. She even wrote her thesis in school about the effects of deep diving on the human body. Her thesis led her to meet Francisco Ferreras, a famous diver in the sport. She studied him. She became a safety diver for him, and eventually married him. Audrey and Francisco became inseparable as they both shared a love of the extreme sport. They were the it couple within freediving. I don't think it would surprise anyone to hear that they egged each other on, pushing each other to go farther than ever before. Before marrying Francisco, Audrey was diving 200 feet, maybe 300 feet. But after training with her husband, she was quickly doubling her depth. And it was Francisco who taught Audrey about the most dangerous way to freedive, known as no limits. Some freedivers just swim down as far as they can and then back up again. But what Audrey was learning was more thrill ride than sport. In no limits, divers are dragged down as far as they can by a 200-pound weight on a cable. And then, once they've reached 500 feet underwater, they inflate an air balloon that shoots them back up to the surface, all before their lungs burst from lack of oxygen. About 100 people die every year from this extreme form of freediving. At the bottom of the dive, you can expect to feel immense pressure on your body. This shrivels your lungs to the size of oranges, and your heart slows down to 15 beats per minute. Every part of you screams for oxygen, but underwater no one can hear you scream. From bottom to top, the dive should take no more than 3 minutes. Any longer, and your chances of recovery are slim. On October 12, 2002, Audrey and a small crew set up their gear for Audrey to try and break the 531.5-foot record. It was a record that her husband had set just 2 years before. During training, Audrey regularly got down to 500 feet, 520 feet, even 550 feet. So when it came to the actual record attempt, no one was prepared for the tragedy that was about to unfold. At first, everything was going well for Audrey. She took her deepest breath, grabbed the weight, and plummeted downward to where even the sunlight didn't touch. In just over a minute, Audrey had reached the 550-foot mark and let go of the weight. She reached for her air balloon and twisted the nozzle to inflate it, but nothing happened. How would you feel in the moment when you understand that you're trapped under the ocean with no way to get back up? I can't imagine the feeling of panic and fear she probably faced in those horrifying last moments, all alone in the darkness of the ocean. Safety divers scrambled down to meet her and used their air balloons to launch Audrey to the surface. 8 minutes after she first went under, Audrey's limp body resurfaced. Her husband tried to resuscitate her, but it was too late. Audrey had drowned trying to break her own husband's world record. And while that's tragic enough, I couldn't believe what the rest of the story uncovered. As the diving community investigated Audrey's death, they found some frankly horrifying details. It was possible that it wasn't an accident at all. Many divers claimed that Francisco, Audrey's husband, had been lazy about his wife's dive. He checked over Audrey's gear before she dived that day, but refused to let anyone else touch it. He didn't have enough safety divers there, and there was no medical team for a sport where divers regularly pass out and even die. Francisco had cut corners and broken so many of the rules to get Audrey into the water that day. What happened to her air balloon? Why didn't they have doctors on the boat? Why so few safety divers? There seemed to be more questions than answers. I don't know if Audrey's death was actually an accident, or maybe it was just a combination of everything going wrong at once. But since Audrey's death, the diving board has refused to admit any record set by No Limits Dives, saying that it's too dangerous. Let's stay in the water for our next horrifying tale of death-defying records. If you want to understand Guy Garman, you have to go back years before his tragic world record-breaking attempt. Guy, or Doc Deep as his friends knew him, was an ear, nose, and throat doctor who loved the water. In fact, he loved it so much that he sold up his medical practice in Tennessee and moved his family to St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands in 2010. There he found his true calling, scuba diving, and as he trained with his mentor, Ed Buckley, who owned a dive shop on the island, he got good at diving. Like, really good. Over 600 dives later, Guy had earned his technical deep water diving certification. The deep water around the island was perfect for Guy, who loved the feeling of being underwater for longer periods of time, and so he came up with a plan to break the world record of the deepest dive with scuba gear. Currently, the record was 1,090 feet. Guy wanted to get to 1,200 feet, the deepest any human had ever been using scuba gear, and Doc Deep was determined. With the same precision and training he applied in his medical career, Guy took 2 years to get ready for the dive. He studied air mixtures. He investigated dive conditions. He researched previous attempts to see how he could go deeper. On the day of the attempt, Guy was convinced that he had taken every precaution, triple-checked all his gear, and had everything in order. Guy had arranged for a safety team of over 200 people, including safety divers, 3 boats, and several medical staff in case anything went wrong. Because in this sport, things often go wrong. Every year, divers suffer all kinds of side effects from taking deep dives like this. Anything under 300 feet, and you're at risk of HPNS, a condition that causes headaches, tremors, vomiting, dizziness, and risks of brain damage. And if you don't surface properly, you could even get air bubbles in your blood that could kill you instantly. Everything Doc Deep was doing was at a maximum risk. At 6 a.m. on Saturday, August 15, 2015, Guy took his last breath from the surface before slowly heading down. With a team of divers that included his son, Guy went down to 200 feet with no problems. Because only 12 people in the world had the kind of experience Guy had, his safety team stopped here, watching Guy descend alone, deeper and deeper into the black depths of the ocean. Another safety team of divers got ready to meet Guy on his way up at an air station at 360 feet. If everything went to plan, they would have expected to see Guy around 38 minutes later. But the team never saw Guy. Somewhere in that deep dark, something went very wrong. The team waited 3 minutes past the time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but still Guy wasn't coming up from the deepest dive anyone had ever performed. They started to think that maybe Guy had gotten confused, or maybe something was wrong with his gear. The team on the boats, including Guy's wife and son, waited as long as possible. Eventually, everyone agreed that Guy had drowned, but it wouldn't be another 4 days until the island police department confirmed they'd recovered Guy's body. And to this day, the secret of what actually happened went with Guy to his watery grave. I'm not sure if you'd call Guy brave or impulsive. Some expert divers point out that Guy's training was too fast. Of his 600 dives, only 35 were ever below 500 feet. Before his record attempt, Guy had only ever managed 800 feet, so to jump from that to 1,200 feet seemed impossible and reckless. But others say that nobody on Earth was more planned or prepared than Doc Deep. Maybe there are just limits to how far we can go under the water. How do you die from a parachute jump if your parachute opens just like it's supposed to? Tragically, Nick Piantanita learned this the hard way. When he was a young boy in Union City, New Jersey, he built homemade parachutes and strapped stray cats to them before throwing them off his 5th-floor apartment balcony. And when neighbors complained about Nick's cruelty, he strapped himself in instead, breaking his arm on the fall. But nothing would slow Nick down. He was a lifelong adventurer, always looking for the next kick, the next adrenaline rush. He joined the Army. Then he became the first person to climb the sheer cliffs of Angel Falls in Peru. But there was always something about parachuting that captivated Nick. In 1962, when he was 31, Nick took a skydiving class, and after his first jump, he decided then and there that he would do whatever it took to break the record of the highest parachute jump in the world. Officially, it was an 83,000-foot jump by a Soviet, and Nick wanted to bring the record back to America. Unofficially, an American Armed Forces corporal had jumped from 102,800 feet in military tests. But because of the classified nature of those tests, the height was never verified. But to Nick, that was the benchmark. If he truly wanted to make his mark on history, he had to go higher than any man had ever gone, record or not. But the problem was that outside of one short class, Nick knew nothing about parachuting, or heights, or the materials you need to survive a jump like that, or the money, or the connections. But do you think that would stop him? I don't know of a man as resourceful and determined as Nick. As soon as he tasted the freedom and adrenaline of that first parachute jump, his life revolved around the challenge that would eventually take his life. The first thing Nick did was take a job as a truck driver, so that he could raise enough money. The trucking job also gave Nick freedom every weekend to learn everything he could about balloon technology, meteorology, and survival suits, and he started writing letters. He wrote letters to the company that NASA spacesuits. They agreed to help him. He wrote letters to engineers about building a space balloon. They helped him. He wrote letters to a U.S. senator about funding and support. He helped Nick. He even wrote letters to the president about bringing the jump record back to America. If you knew Nick, you'd agree that he could be the most charming, charismatic, or plain old stubborn person on the planet. What he wanted, he got. Everyone who knew Nick heard about his plan, but not everybody agreed with him. Some told him that the jump was impossible. Some laughed at him. Some just egged him on. But Nick didn't give up. He knew the risks. He understood that if he made the jump, his body would experience temperatures close to -100 degrees Fahrenheit, and he would fall faster than any human, traveling over 150 miles per hour in free fall for several minutes. Everything had to be perfect just to survive, much less break a record. 2 years after his first official parachute jump, Nick had built the Strato Jump, a glorified porta-potty built from styrofoam and steel. In his first attempt, he only made it 22,000 feet in the air before strong winds ripped open his balloon. Nick parachuted down into the city dump. On his second attempt, Nick made it 123,500 feet, the record for the highest solo balloon flight. But he couldn't disconnect his oxygen tank from the balloon, meaning he couldn't jump out of the container that took him so high. Engineers on the ground heard Nick's grunts as he struggled with the oxygen tanks. "I can't believe it," he said in frustration. Instead of the jump he had planned, Nick had to burst the balloon and come back down with the safety parachute still attached to his capsule. No freefall, no record. But on his third jump on May 1st, 1966, everything looked ready to go. Nick had even brought a small wrench he'd bought for $1 just in case he had problems with the oxygen tank again. The small styrofoam-lined shed lifted off from the earth. From the airfield in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Nick took off one last time. Nick's team was in constant communication with the amateur parachutist. Although he was the most prepared man they'd ever encountered, nothing he did or said could have got them ready for Nick's next transmission. Around 57,000 feet, there was a weird whooshing sound over the radio. They heard Nick scrambling in a panic, and he started to say, "Emerge, But the radio was cut off. They heard nothing more from Nick. After a few minutes of radio silence, the team decided to cut the balloon remotely, and Nick floated gently back down to the ground, 60 miles away from his starting point. The crew that was following the record attempt found Nick alive, but unconscious, still strapped into his seat. Bizarrely, his helmet visor was open. I have to warn you here, this is speculation. I've read the stories from people who knew Nick. They all said he was the kind of guy who would have opened his own visor, probably to clear the condensation. Sometimes he thought he was invincible, but at that height the suit would have depressurized, and the effects would have been devastating. Small air bubbles would have formed throughout his tissues and blood vessels and in his brain. Those air bubbles would have shredded Nick's body from the inside. Emergency crews took Nick's body to hospital where he fell into a coma. Nick died 4 months later without ever recovering consciousness. And it wasn't until Felix Baumgartner's famous jump in 2012 that anyone ever succeeded at breaking the highest parachute jump in the world. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that I have a favorite tragedy, but I love the story of Donald Campbell. Born in 1921 in Surrey, England, Donald was destined to break records. His father had already set 13 land and water records, but when Donald's father died in 1948, Donald decided that he would challenge his dad's legacy. At first, Donald used his father's old boat, a Bluebird K4, to break the records his dad had made, even on the same lake as his dad. And one by one, Donald started making history with faster and faster speeds. I think it's amazing that like father, like son, Donald's records started building up. Donald's most amazing year was 1964 when he traveled to Australia and broke the land speed record, going 403 miles per hour in a modified dragster. And just a few months later, also in Australia, he broke the water speed record on the anniversary of his father's death, going 276 miles per hour. He became the first and only person to ever set both land and water records within a single year. And it was that very water record that Donald was determined to beat. The thing you have to know about Donald is that he was an incredibly superstitious guy. I'm not really the kind of person to believe in all that, but Donald did. He hated the color green. He wouldn't have 13 of anything, and he believed that nothing ever good happened on a Friday. He even raced with his lucky mascot in his boat, a little toy bear called Mr. Woppet. So that's why Donald, with Mr. Woppet on board, decided that Wednesday, January 4th, 1967, would be the luckiest day to break his own record. Donald planned to hit the 300-mile-per-hour mark in the same Bluebird boat his father had always raced. He even believed it was lucky to race on the same lake, Coniston Water, where his dad had made several records. The lake, up in northern England, was perfect that day. The water was glassy and still. There was little wind and the sun was shining. The conditions were ready for Donald to go, but everyone knew that Donald would be testing the very edge of what was possible. His boat was already 12 years old and only designed to go 250 miles per hour. Not only that, but Donald himself had just recovered from a nasty crash that almost killed him. News crews lined the shore and people jostled to catch a glimpse of the hometown hero Donald Campbell and his famous Bluebird boat. After a bit of testing and a wave to the crowd, Donald hopped on board and gunned the engines. Everyone expected to see something amazing, but no one is server ready to witness what was about to come. As Donald started off down the lake, he quickly gained speed, well past the 250-mile-per-hour max speed his boat was intended for. From his seat, Donald was on the radio to his team, talking about what was going on inside the craft. And this was when he started to mention trouble. "I can't see much," he radioed his team. "The water's not good." But still, he didn't put on the brakes and his team didn't worry. This kind of stuff happens all the time in this sport, and Donald knew what he was doing. At least that's what they thought. He radioed in again. "Full power," he said, saying that the boat had reached its maximum speed for the day. Donald had done it. He'd broken his own record and was now going faster than 300 miles per hour. Maybe it was nothing to worry about after all. But then everyone could see that there was something wrong with the Bluebird boat. The front started to lift off the water. All it takes is 3 degrees of lift, and you're in trouble. The wind caught the boat and started to flip it. "I'm going," radioed Donald, who could feel he was losing control of the giant craft. The boat launched 50 feet up into the sky, looking for a second that it might fly up like a plane. But then it quickly flipped over in the air. While in the air, the crew heard Donald's final radio call. "I'm upside down." With a devastating crunch, the boat somersaulted as it smashed back into the water. Within seconds, the Bluebird was smashed to pieces and quickly sank down into the lake. Some of the crowd wondered if somehow Donald had escaped the worst of the damage and was somewhere under the water. But horrifically, The impact of the crash killed him instantly. Before rescue boats could arrive, the Bluebird had already sunk beneath the waves, with only a few floating pieces left on the water. Divers tried to find the boat 120 feet down in the lake, but they didn't have the proper equipment. Without anybody or a boat to recover, the mystery of what happened stayed hidden. Later that month, Donald was given the Queen's Commendation for brave conduct, for his courage in attacking the world water speed record. And for over 30 years, Donald and his Bluebird rested at the bottom of the lake. In 2001, divers found the boat and recovered the body of the famous speedster. And when they did, they discovered the true and horrific reason for his death. When Donald smashed into the surface, the impact had decapitated him. A DNA match with his daughter proved that they'd found him. They even recovered Mr. Woppet, still at the helm of the boat. I have to think that maybe it wasn't such a lucky mascot after all. The Bluebird was returned to the small town where Donald grew up. You can still visit the museum, and you can touch the very boat that killed Donald while he was breaking his own record. Just don't do it on a Friday. Every one of these men and women were fearless risk-takers, but it makes me think that maybe having a little fear can be a good thing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.